Let me introduce the lecture series. This fall term will be these following the 4 weeks, the 4 Tuesdays of October, minus the middle week, that is the third Tuesday, which will be our reading week. So we always have 2 lectures, and then a reading week, and then 2 concluding lectures. So essentially every Tuesday of October, except that reading week, the third week, we won't be here, but I'll anticipate that you'll be reading in the book a bit. The book, and I hope that all of you have had a chance to pick up the book, is by John Ortberg. It's an excellent study for us. I try to always pick out books that you will find interesting and is an easy read, but instructional. Most of the materials, as you know, that we use during the Academy are for the Oxford and Cambridge scholars, but this particular book is written by an American, John Ortberg, and John was at the Willow Creek Church in Chicago, one of the big mega churches that had really developed an enormously interesting approach to modernity, to addressing modern life and modern people, and it grew to a tremendous church run by Bill Hybels, who was the senior pastor, and John Ortberg was on the staff there. He is now at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church in Pasadena, again one of the most innovative parish churches in the country. But this book is particularly sound and appropriate for our use because it talks about how to grow deeper in our spiritual life, and we're addressing that topic that is very contemporaneous with us, where people say often when asked that they're spiritual but not religious. You hear that often. And then you hear among our people in our parish churches that sometimes they'll say, well, I've been religious all my life, I've been a participant in my parish church all my life, but honestly speaking, I don't feel very close to God. I go through all the routine, the ritual, all the liturgy and so on, but there's something missing. I have this certain sense that I have not really made a connection with God in an intimate way. So that whole theme of spiritual and not religious, that means people that have a spiritual sense but don't attend any organized religion or parish church, on the one hand is very common in our society, or the other way around, people that are attenders at churches but just don't feel very spiritually fed. So we're going to try to address that topic, and the way we're doing it is to try to look at our faith and see what elements we have missed along the way. Perhaps missed from not seeing certain Bible verses that are key, and perhaps never having really looked at the development of our spiritual life. Most of us in Western Christianity and in the mainline congregations, and by mainline I mean Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Lutheran, most of our congregations are very much head-oriented. And because we come out of sort of the German scholastic tradition of that, we feel we grow because we grow intellectually. The more we read, the more we learn, the wiser we are, and we apply that to religion. And to a certain degree that is appropriate. But on the other hand, we sometimes in our mainline congregations lose a more mystical sense of God, the more mystery side, what we call the divine mysterium of God. Those parts of God's nature which would give us a deeper and richer spiritual life. So based on that, I've designed this study for our October session, and I think you'll really enjoy it, and the book is terrific. It's not only substantive, but it has bits of humor in it. It's a good read, and I think it will open a lot of very interesting questions for our discussion. The objective of the course is that we end our 4 sessions together in the 5th reading week with a sense of deeper spirituality, that we connect with God in ways that perhaps we've never connected before. and that we realize that this God who we proclaim and worship is extraordinarily accessible. And contrary to what we may have experienced in the past, God is essentially awaiting our connection with Him. And that's very good news indeed. I often end my sermons here at St. John's by saying, and that's very good news. Because the gospel is good news. And the good news is that you have the possibility of, and hopefully the probability of, deepening your spiritual life as per the end of this course. Our methodology, of course, is lecture and discussion, and I'm always open to questions. And hopefully what we'll do is we'll lecture for the first hour. We'll have our normal break with, our famous popcorn and refreshments. And then we'll come back to have some capstone comments and then questions and then end the evening. Are there any questions opening tonight as we begin? Well, with that, let us just quickly go around the room and just introduce who you are. We picked up the newcomers, but let's just go around once again just to say hi to everybody and introduce who you are.
I'm Dr. Ray Booth, and I'm a deacon of the Word and Service for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I'm the assistant brain to Bill.
Right.
The assistant brain, yeah.
Right.
I'm Pastor Bill Leeds, pastor of Living Lord Lutheran Church up in Humboldt.
I'm Carol Morrison, and I'm a member of St. John's.
I'm Mike Doyle, and I'm a member of St. John's.
Cindy Doyle, a member of St. John's.
Agnes Pearson, a searcher.
Great, great.
I like that church. I'm Janet Moore, I'm a searcher too.
That's great. Just the type we love here at St. John's.
Lorraine Bell from Living Lord Lutheran Church.
Arlene Barkent from Living Lord Lutheran Church.
Yeah,
John
John.
Hamilton, Rich Mass.
Pam Rayburn from Zion in Cornersburg.
Lisa Ackerman from Emmanuel Lutheran.
And friend.
And Donna.
Kevin Sigwood from Holy Trinity in Salem.
Judith Lobaugh from Lord of Life in Canfield.
Janet Smart from St. James Episcopal Church.
Rick Thompson from St. Paul and Warren.
Janet Barker from the St. John's Lutheran Church.
There you go. The historic. Getting more historic by the day.
Right, me too.
Oh, Karen Edwards, ditto.
Alta Johnson from St. John's.
Marilyn Lindberger from John Huss, evangelical, something about the creed, anyway, now St. John.
Well, it's nice to have everybody here. Well, my assumption is, and why I had you introduce yourself at this point, is actually into the syllabus, is that we are all members of parishes, and we are at seekers, all of us as well. That's actually why we're here. That's why people join churches and why you're members of the church, because we anticipate growth in the faith and to try to come to grips with this mystery called God. And so all of us gathered here are theists in a way, because we all have a certain sense that there's something out there, something above us, something more than what we normally can appreciate by just touching, feeling, or seeing. Now, most people could be broken down into 3 or 4 different categories. At the one side, we have atheists. Whenever you put the little initial, the little vowel A in front of theist, theist means God, and if you put A before it, it contradicts it. It means without God. So an atheist is someone who either has never been exposed to the faith or has decided for one reason or another, either by common experience or by reading or by some circumstance of their life, that they have decided that in their mind there is no God, and that everything can be explained in simply scientific or logical means. Atheists will tell you often that they feel that reason is the highest gift of man, and that you reason, and only what you can reason is true. Now, we could go into, in teaching philosophy, we could go into those many arguments and many sides of the coin, as philosophers like to analyze and to carefully parse different words and expressions. But be that as it may, let's just say that atheists have decided that, and they have drawn the conclusion, and are comfortable with, in the main, that there is no God. And what we see is all that there is. And everything else could be explained somehow, but not in a theistic or in a religious way. There's another category of people who are called agnostics. Agnostics are people who simply have not decided nor have drawn the conclusion that there is no God, but they're not quite sure about it. They sort of have a sense that, yes, there must be something more, but I can't really decide what it is, and I'm not really comfortable with the way that churches or synagogues or mosques have decided to explain or define the mystical or the unknown. And so for an agnostic, they are questioners. They simply are undecided. They haven't closed the door on the possibility of God, but yet they haven't subscribed fully to whatever faith might attract them. And they are often people who search, and can be searchers, in a nice word for them, searchers who are still open to the possibility, but haven't been convinced yet that what religious teachings are true. So that's an agnostic. Now, we have many people, such as many of my students often at the medical school and at the college, who are scientists in the sense that they truly believe that their religion is essentially the word of science. That is, that science ultimately can and should be able to explain everything that is. And any unknown, rather than attributed to a god or some concept or something, they feel uncomfortable about that, because they feel that it's only a matter of time until we discover the mystery that we're looking for. So in a way, they are atheists, but they have put their trust in science. For theists, which we basically are here, we have been either brought up to believe a certain way, or we have searched it out and made our own journey to discovery of the faith, whatever and however we define that. And it is not that it is in conflict with science. Good theists can acknowledge that science has every reason to be and every complement to our faith, and not destructive to our faith. So that if you're a scientist, you don't have to, or if you're a religionist or a person that believes in God, you don't have to set that aside and decide that you're either one or the other, because science can be very complementary. At Dartmouth College, when I was there, I studied with one of the great astrophysicists, and he always made the point that philosophers and scientists, people of religion and faith, simply look at the same object, perhaps from different dimensions or different ways. A religion professor of mine at Yale once said, "Religion and science are not in conflict at all. Religion simply asks different questions than science asks. Religion asks the questions of why things exist. What is the meaning of things? What is the purpose of something? On the other hand, science describes how things came to be, how things work, how things are organized, but do not ask the questions of meaning or purpose." So you can see that science and religion have no reason to be in conflict whatsoever, because we're asking different questions regarding the same thing. So once we say that science has their field, and we as philosophers or religious or theologians have our field. Both are legitimate. Both can show and cast light on the human endeavor or creation. So, as theists, we are people of faith. We walk different journeys. We have different concepts of God. And tonight, in these lectures, we'll talk about how these concepts develop and how we can see different sides of the same thing, and all are legitimate. Well, let's go back to the origins of our Christian faith, since we're all Christians here tonight, and realize that we come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, meaning that our origins and our base is Judaism. I often say to people, you know, Jesus himself was a Jew. Jesus himself did not know the creeds. The creeds were written 325 in the 300s. So to say the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or the formulas of the faith, the rules of the faith, Jesus knew none of that. Jesus did not know the New Testament. He had no idea who Paul was or anyone else. Now, he did know James because it was his brother, and he did know some of the writers that would later write part of the New Testament because they were followers or contemporaneously with him. But as far as picking up a book and turning to the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark or whatever, that was written far long after Jesus died. So these books that we consider normative for our faith were not known to the founder of our faith. Now that in no way depreciates their value, because these are written by people of faith after the fact to testify to the significance of Jesus himself. But to get to the real core of what Jesus himself taught and believed, sometimes we can even step outside of this book and see what others taught and what he himself would have known. And what would he have known? He would have known what has, in our basis, would have been some of the teachings of the Old Testament. In the book of Acts and in other places in the New Testament, it talks about the family of Jesus going to the synagogue, as was their custom. That's what it says in there, as was their custom. We also see Jesus at the age of about 13 reading from the scrolls of the temple, which is very interesting because it indicates a couple things. Number one, that Jesus knew how to read, which was very unusual for people of that first century. But moreover, he knew the Hebrew and was able to interpret the scriptures. Now, where did he get that training? The training must have come from his mother Mary and his father Joseph, and from attending, perhaps, although we have no record of it, but it might be obvious that he attended some of the classes at the synagogue, or he sat in and heard the rabbis speaking, so that he began to learn the traditions of Judaism. Oftentimes when Jesus preaches, he preaches the lessons of the Old Testament. He draws upon the prophets and rephrases them to his constituency. Jesus was in the mainstream of Judaism, and yet stood outside of the mainstream enough to be critical of some of those religious figures, namely the Pharisees that always come under conflict. But he knew perfectly well what the Pharisees knew and believed, because as you see him encounter the Pharisees, and by the way, the Pharisees, for those of you who may be a little fuzzy on this, they were very strict observers of the law. They were the people like your mainstay members of your parish that are there every Sunday, never miss a Sunday, never miss a Bible class, are very faithful in all their religiosity, in the best sense of the word. The Pharisees were critical of Jesus because Jesus seemed to be a little slippery with some of the norms that they felt were significant. The strict observance of the law. You know, like for example, when they ate, you know, on a Sunday or on a not a Sunday, but a Sabbath. And the Pharisees are critical. Well, you know, why should, you know, you shouldn't be doing any work on the Sabbath. You know, the Bible tells you Sabbath is to be kept sacred. Why are you doing that? And then Jesus said, you know, the law is made for man, not man made for the law. Remember? And he's kind of critical of those. And he seems to take a different take. He seems to be able to see beyond, in, under, and through, and see the real meaning of those texts that sometimes was missed by the religious authorities. The Torah, for Jews, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Those are the sacred texts that they consider to be the bedrock of their faith. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, those of you who are familiar know that the Old Testament contains much more than just those 5 books. It contains all the prophets, it contains the Proverbs, it contains the Psalms, the writings, the letters. All those stories that are in there are in addition to the 5 books, which are known as the Torah. But to Jewish faith, the Torah becomes the normative. And for Jews, the most important thing of the Torah is the law. Now, we as Christians sometimes get a rather negative view of the law, because sometimes they'll say, well, you see, Jesus sort of, excuse the expression, trumped the law. Only in this era would that have context, right? But what that means is that Jesus took an appropriate look at that law and reinterpreted it. Now, we sometimes get the feeling that Christianity is superior to Judaism because we are no longer bound by the law. Paul talks about that. You're no longer slaves to the law. You're free in Christ. Christ has set you free, and so on. So we get a pejorative kind of feel. We get this kind of negative feel that the law must be something that you cast aside and glad we're done with it, glad we're over it, and we're not back there with them, we're over here with us. But that's not the way Jesus saw it. You see, the law was given by whom? God, right. And if God gave the law, it certainly is not something for us to say, well, you know, that has no meaning. Particularly since Jesus has been quoted in one section in which he says, I have come not to change one, listen to this, I have come not to change one iota, not one jot or tittle, which are little marks over Hebrew, of the law. But I have come to fulfill it. Isn't that interesting? Meaning I haven't come to say, forget the 10 Commandments. That's old hat. Jesus would be the first to say, you must observe the 10 Commandments and the law. But I will show you the interpretation of how you apply the law. And so the law for Jews is not something that is cumbersome or binding or negative, as we might have previously thought. But they see the law as a gift. The gift from God, who has given something so that we know how to live our lives. Without the law, we have chaos. Without the law, we have violence. I mean, the civil law, I mean, it's obvious. You go to a stop sign, if you see red, you better stop. Why? Because it's protecting you from going through the stoplight when it's green on the other side. And if you don't observe the red, you're likely to put yourself in danger for someone who is going now on the green, the opposite direction, and whammo, right? Would anybody in the room say we shouldn't have stoplights anymore? Of course not. Well, you might if sometimes, those stoplights, they're so long and you think, there must be something wrong with this light. Do you ever have that and the temptation to see, look to your right, look to your left, see if there's a cop in the mirror?
I stopped at the red light.
I stopped at the red light. But the point is that not all law is negative. And to the Jewish observer, the law was given as a gift of God for God's people. And so the law was to be observed not in a sense of punishment or to make your life unhappy or to take all the joy out of your life, but it was to show you that by living according to the law, you will have a good life. You will not do those things which violate humanity. You will not violate someone else's space or trust. You will learn to be a good, godly person by observing the law. Did the law become somewhat burdensome? Yes, as the years went on, as the religious leaders kept adding law. But think of some of the laws that were in place, the Ten Commandments. Do you think anybody should really debate whether the Ten Commandments are as viable today as they were then? I don't think so. Why are the Ten Commandments there? Given by Moses at the Law of Sinai, are the first in the great law of Judaism. They are the moral code by which you find a godly life. To treat people well, not to lie or steal or cheat, not to kill, not to maim, honor your mother and father, respect people, right? To love God with your whole heart and soul, to love your neighbor as yourself, really it's all contained in there, have no graven images, and so on. Now all that was designed by God for the purpose of human betterment. And so for Jews, they see that as a gift, not as a burden. The Torah is not, except for the Ten Commandments and for some of the core laws, are not as cast in stone, however, as we think. Now, I use that word because the tablets did appear in stone. But the interesting thing that is over Jewish history and Jewish tradition, things have morphed. And I use that word morph, meaning to metamorphosis, is to move from one thing to another or to change or have subtle change. And the interesting thing about Judaism, they are not bound by creeds as we are in the Orthodox side of Christianity. They don't have anything such as they do have the Ten Commandments, obviously. They don't have anything such as the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or all these codes or that kind of thing. Because their religion is much more flexible. And one of the very interesting things is as you see the Old Testament, you see a movement of interpretation from the earliest prophets to the later prophets. And then you see a movement between the Old Testament to the New Testament. I'll speak about this in more clarity in a minute. There are at least 3 stages of interpretation of the law. Now the Sanhedrin was a group of people. You remember Jesus has to appear before the Sanhedrin, or they talk about the Sanhedrin were the sort of elders, those who were overseeing the faith. And they were the ones who were keeping the law and the traditions. It's interesting that in Judaism, from the very earliest writings of Judaism, in the earliest books of Judaism, the early prophets, begin to change, and you see a difference from how God is looked at in the middle prophets, and then you see a real change after the fall of the temple at 70 AD. In the early stages of Judaism, religion was confined to place and time. There was a real sense that God resided in his fullness, in his fullest manifestation, in the Temple of Jerusalem. The Holy of Holies was the most sacred place following the Exodus that came, and that was the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the Exodus out of Egypt, and they carried the stone tablets in the Ark and so on. But eventually, when the holy city of Jerusalem and the temple was built, God was seen to touch, heaven and earth touched, in the solely sanctimonious parts of the Temple of Jerusalem. The chief priests of the temple could only enter the Holy of Holies once a year. There would be the place at the, if you've ever seen if you go back to the history book that we had, they'll show a representation of the temple, Jerusalem, on Temple Mount. There were the portico where the money changers were, remember that, where Jesus goes and overturns the temple, the changers. Well, what that was about is that people would be journeying to do the holy days, like the Passover at the temple, and they had to change their money. Any of you who have traveled in Europe know that you can use dollar bills a lot of the places in Europe, I find, but to your own disadvantage, because they won't give you the best rate if you use dollars, you know. You're better changing to euros now. When I was a student in Germany, I had to have marks, and then when I went to England, it had to be pounds and shillings, and when I went to France, I had to get francs, and when I went to Holland, it was guilders, and and I'd have bags of money like this, and I put my hand out. Is that a guilder or a franc or a Deutsche Mark? Being that the euro is better, but in those days you had to change from shekels, the Jewish money, and you often had to make a temple sacrifice. You had to give, much like where did we get our offering at church? Really from the temple tradition. In other words, you give an offering to express your thankfulness and gratitude for what God has given you. That's our offering in the Christian church. In the Jewish tradition, that was offering you first fruits at the temple, perhaps an animal, or first crops, or at the different festivals of the booths and so on. The point being is that the money changers were satisfying a very, very important function, because they were allowing you to use your currency as you came out of Africa or the Middle East someplace into the currency of the temple. And there was a sense that as you went to the holy city of Jerusalem, you were drawing as close on earth as you could to heaven. And that there was a sense that when you were in the temple and you were being ministered to there and offering sacrifices, that God's presence was extraordinarily close. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70, Judaism then had to move into a different dimension. There was no place left where they could physically go to encounter their God. And as a result, Judaism became a religion of the book, tradition, and interpretation. And this is where the rabbis became so critical to Judaism. And the marvelous thing about the rabbinic tradition is that rabbis can contradict each other. And the wonderful Jewish humor often arises out of these debates and these challenges between one rabbi and another. And we have great rabbis in church history like Hillel and others who will interpret the law. In other words, they will read the law and give their impression and their interpretation of what the law means. It's not always clear how you apply the law in every situation. When I was teaching philosophy, we often posed these kind of questions, ethical questions. What happens if, for example, you should not tell a lie? We're all agreed that that is bad business. And you get a lot of people in a lot of trouble all over the place, even in this country, with all this lying going on. Who do you believe? He said, she said, But now consider a situation like this. Suppose you are a spy for the United States. You work for the CIA. And you are in a foreign country, and you are spying for the country, trying to figure out what kind of defense systems they have or whatever for our own defense, for our country's defense. when I was in Berlin, for example, it was interesting. It was before the wall went down. And we would sit in there was a cafe on Friedrichstrasse, which was very close to Checkpoint Charlie. Remember that? Back in the old East-West days, where the communists had the East and we had the West. And it was funny because you would sit in the cafe and you would read this way. And everybody read that way. You'd look around the room and everybody was doing this. Nobody was reading the paper. You were hiding behind the paper looking around. Everybody was spying, East-West. You had, Germans and French and English and Americans and Russians and East Germans, and everybody was spying, looking around, and so on. So now suppose that you are caught. I almost was caught. I wasn't a spy. I had a confession here. But going through East Germany, I had a passport. There was about a 150-mile drive from Hof in western Germany, and then you had to go through East Germany to get to Berlin. And if you drove in, you had to go through these checkpoints. First the West German, then you had to go to East Germany, and the East Germans, of course, were under Russian domination, and they had their own police force and so on. So I lived in Berlin for a period of time, and when I left Berlin, I flew out and flew home. Now, when you reside in the city in Berlin for any length of time, you have to register as a foreigner. And so I had registered in Berlin as a foreigner when I was there because I had lived there for quite a while. However, when I flew out of Berlin, I didn't deregister myself. Dumb American. I mean, I never thought you should go and say, I'm leaving, bye. So I return through Hof, and I'm driving into Berlin now after a 2-year hiatus, having not been there for 2 years. When I go through, the West Germans are fine, and when I go to the East Germans, they look at my passport and they say, Herr Schreckengast, jawohl, yes, sir. We have a problem with you. Well, what's the problem? Well, we need to talk to you about something. And so they pulled me out of the line and put me into this little room. I mean, it's out of a Hollywood movie, I'm telling you. This little room on a little stool with a light, like that. And this big, bustling East German policeman came in, and I could think, this is not going to end well. And she said, where have you been in 2 years? What do you mean, where have I been in 2 years? I've been in the United States. We have no record that you left Germany. Well, I didn't deregulate, I didn't know that I had to, and I'm stumbling around and so on. This is not good, she says. Well, back in those days, that was serious business because they weren't fooling around. I mean, you were in East Germany, you were under Russian control, you were way away now from American protection, and there you are, all by your lonesome, and they have your passport.
Yeah, right. Oh, gosh.
And so she walks out with my passport, and there I'm sitting there, and another guy, Volkspolizei, comes in, that's the German Staatspolizei, and he comes in and says, this does not match, and furthermore, your passport is invalid. I said, what do you mean it's invalid? He said, Secretary of State is not the Secretary of State of the United States. Well, here's the problem. Administrations had changed. And the Secretary of State that had issued my passport was no longer the Secretary of State of the United States. Well, our passports are valid for a length of time, 7 years, 10 years, or whatever. But for them, this is a fake passport. Now I'm not only a problem of not deregistering, I have a fake passport. And, well, I'm here, by the way, as you see. So all is well that ended well, but it was problematic. What they didn't ask me, if I had been a spy, suppose they had asked me, we want you to reveal all the people that you report to. Now they had me in a situation that was dangerous because I had no advocates except myself there. But suppose they had asked that question. The law tells us, and we're getting back to lecture, see, I'm not off track here. The law tells us, thou shalt not lie. But suppose they had said, do you know all of the people that you are supposed to answer to? Now, pretend I'm a spy now. And that I know who assigned me there, who sent me there, what information I'm supposed to be gathering there, and so on. What do? Do I say, oh, sure, I'll give me a piece of paper, I'll write down every name of every person I know, knowing that if I do that, some of the persons their life might be in jeopardy. And as a result, I said, no, I don't know anybody, okay? Now, in one way, I have ignored the law, which says you shouldn't lie, but on the other hand, I have protected people in that situation that might be jeopardized by my telling the truth. This is exactly the situation that the rabbis begin to address post-fall of the temple. And the rabbis begin to debate this. What if you're in a situation like this? How do you apply the law or don't apply the law? Does God expect you to use the law completely as it is written without interpretation? Or does God expect you to interpret the law for the welfare or the benefit of those who might be harmed or benefited by it? And so we move from this strict codification of law into an ability of the rabbis to begin to interpret and subtly analyze how the law might be applied. So this means that Judaism began to develop this sort of flexibility of the faith, so that you could believe certain things on both sides of an issue and can be considered to be faithful. That there was not just one way. You know, in Christianity, we've fallen in some parts of Christianity into what we call radical fundamentalism. That is that you know, what's that bumper sticker? God wrote it, I believe it, that's it. Right? Meaning no interpretation. And believing that everything in the Bible, you know, as I've done before in these classes, these poor Bibles, they suffer. You know, that the Bible dropped out of heaven like that. Oh, what's this? You know, oh, it must be the Word of God here. Well, that isn't the way the Bible was written. It was written by human beings under the inspiration of God, but there are many conflicts and stories that don't match. There's 2 creation stories, you know, not just one. They must not have been satisfied with one, so they added another. But the point being is that within Judaism, there is a built-in flexibility and adaptability, much more so than there is in conservative Christianity, whereby it's, you believe this, and this is the only way, the one way, and that's it. In Judaism, there's much more flexibility. Now, there is a conservative Judaism, part 2, which are the very Orthodox Jews, that wear the black, you know, outfits, and wear beards, won't drive on a Sabbath, walk to temple, and so on. They're strict observers of the law. But for Reform Jews and for progressive Judaism, you'll find that there's a lot of flexibility. And one interesting thing is that the rabbis over the history debate and argue. In fact, one of the joys of being a rabbi is to argue with another rabbi on some subtle point of the law. And in the end, everyone's right, and no one is right. Because there is no right answer. It's all in interpretation. It's a very interesting thing. Now you can see how Jesus approached the contradiction of the law in some place against the Pharisees, who were strictly interpreting the law. And he'd say, yeah, but in this situation, isn't it better? What happens? I'm not supposed to work on the Sabbath. What happens if somebody falls sick and I'm a doctor? Should I not work and try to cure that person on the Sabbath? Of course, our answer would be, of course you have to do what you do. Even though the Sabbath is a high respected law within Judaism. So the flexibility that Jesus saw was the exact flexibility that was being adapted in Judaism. So the Torah, although central, is flexible. There are no creeds. The law is considered a gift, not a burden, and interpretation is of the essence. So that we can debate faith within Judaism and sit together in the same synagogue or the same temple. There's a certain degree of that within our churches, but there can be also a kind of stifling sense in some congregations that either you believe this or you're out. And you know what I'm talking about. That there is no variation, there's no possibility even to ask questions. In this congregation, which is wonderful, we are able to talk, debate, and question, and I love it because it makes me think, and I work through things with you as you think things, and we work them through together. That's very rabbinic. A rabbi will never answer you directly with a direct declarative statement. At least we're talking in progressive Judaism. If you ask Rabbi, what is the meaning of such and such? And the rabbi will mostly like to do the traditional Jewish way, I'll tell you a story. Right? There once was a man and a woman, and they lived in a small house someplace, and so on. And then at the end, you scratch your head and say, well, what did he say? What's the meaning of that? And the rabbi will say, what do you think I meant? And you tell him what you think. And you think, that's an interesting idea. I'll think about it too. Now, did you get an answer? Not really, but really. Soren Kierkegaard has a wonderful expression which he says, there are things, most of the things, teachings of the faith are things that never were and always are. I love that. He's a German-Danish theologian. Things that never were, but always are. Now that sounds, what in the heck is he talking about there? It means when you read the story of Adam and Eve, it's a story that never was, but nonetheless always is. Is it the story of two human beings in some garden over in between the Tigris and Euphrates River? That's where we think civilization, that's called the cradle of civilization, Iraq now. But that merger of the two is where we think that that's the basic cradle of civilization. Is that where the original Garden of Eden was? We don't know. Is the Garden of Eden to be read literally? Is it 30 degrees latitude and 40 degrees longitude? Is it between those two rivers and no place else? Did everything start with two human beings, all of a sudden dropped out of heaven someplace? Or is it meant to be a story that talks about much deeper things than a scientific issue of how two human beings started the human race? For a rabbi, they're comfortable with the idea of exploring and thinking through what is the meaning of that story. What did God have in mind when he inspired somebody to write that story? Who are these two human beings? What is the implication of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life? Was there a literal snake, or is that meant to be a metaphor, an example, a symbol of something much deeper and much more profound? Is God worrying about zoology at that point? Is God designing a textbook of heredity and genetics? Or is God trying to send a symbol and message in a story, as Kierkegaard says, that never was, but always is? Meaning that the story, as such, never was, but the meaning that God means within that story always is. You see what I'm saying? So if you come to a story like Genesis, and we're going to look at this right after the break. If you come to a story of Genesis, how do we read that story? One of the very first stories of the book of the Bible. Why did God and the men that were inspired by God and the group that put the Bible together and decided that that would be the first story to be in the book? Remember, it didn't fall out of the sky like that. It was put together. And assemblies like this decided which order things would be in and what would go in the Bible. God didn't dictate, you know, chapter 1 has to be this and it has to be page 1. Remember, even the Bible had no paragraphs and no capitals and no punctuation and no titles. All that we read in the Bible is all somebody's editing to put in there, you know, like the prodigal son. That story had no title. Somebody put that prodigal son in there and it's stuck ever since, and they'll say, oh, the story about the prodigal son. Well, suppose some other editor had looked at that and said, no, it's not the prodigal son, it's the benevolent father. We might read that story differently. Or suppose the story had not had somebody edited and put in the prodigal son or the benevolent father, say the jealousy of the elder brother. Or what if we had put another title to it and said, it's a story about the mercifulness of God. The story never was, but always is. Was there a prodigal son? Was there somebody that fell by the wayside or that went into the far and distant country? What about the Good Samaritan story? Was there really somebody that had fell by the roadside? Or was that the rabbinic way, as the rabbis always teach, by a story and say, let me tell you a story. There was once a man who walked down the street and someone had fallen down on the road and the religious people went by and ignored it. Somebody else who was a Samaritan, an outsider, saw it, acted upon it, and gained the merit and favor of God by it. Never was, but always is. Does the story apply to our human condition? You bet it does. Is it important that we figure out whose name was, who was that man that fell there? I mean, how old was he? Was he 35 or 50? He wasn't wearing sandals, so now that must have been he was an Egyptian. And, his hair was not blonde. It was, who cares? That's not the essence. And that's what fundamentalism brings us off target, off message, because we get hung up on detail rather than the message, right? And does it matter to God that you know that story literally in every jot and tittle, or does he want to convey some important meaning by telling you that story? You see, remember how the rabbis teach. You ask them a question, what does it mean to give what does it mean to give Christian charity, right? They would say, well, I'm not in the Christian charity business, a rabbi would say. A rabbi would say, you'd say, what does it mean for me to live as a human being in a charitable mode? And the rabbi, rather than saying, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to give 10% of your income, and the second thing you have to do is you have to do this, this, and this. The rabbi never answered that. He would say, let me tell you a story. There once was a man who was walking on a road, and someone had fallen into distress. And the religious people, who should have known better, came walking around, but they were too busy or they were too righteous to see a poor person there. They said, well, somebody else will take care of that. Remember that old expression, let George do it? I wonder who George is. I've been looking for George for years. But if you think about it, the story, you see, has nothing to do with details. It has everything to do with meaning. And that's the secret of Rabbinic Judaism. Because as the rabbis began to interpret, they can have flexibility and to adapt the story and the teachings of the Bible to your particular situation in your life. They can contemporize a story, and that's the genius of it. They're not locked back in there to the first century. They are very much able to come into the 20th century and address the problem of your life directly. And you will ask a question of how do I deal with my mother who's got dementia? The rabbi will tell you, there once was an old woman who was living in so on. There was no old woman living in so on. He's leaving that as a story. But out of that story, you draw the implications of what God intends you to do within the context of your own life. That's the beauty of Judaism, that the rabbi interprets, massages the writings, not in a creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and I can teach anybody that creed. I can teach an atheist that creed. They can recite it better than any faithful person could recite it and not believe one word of it. But for a Jew, you see, the law and working with the law and under the law is a privilege, because as you do your work, they call it a mitzvah, you are living out your relationship to God. And where does that relationship begin? It begins in Genesis, the creation story, of which we'll look at after you popcorn yourself. All right.